Evening, guys. So tonight I'm going to read a little bit from 2 Samuel 12, but to catch you up on the preliminary part of the story. So David likes this lady called Bathsheba, and so David is king at this point, so, he thinks he can have any woman that he wants. So he inquires to get this lady over, they do the deed, and she then declares afterwards, after some time, that she's now pregnant. So this is a little bit of a predicament for David. He's like, okay, what am I going to do? She's married. So then he's like, okay, let's get the husband, let's get Uriah the Hittite over, wine and dine him, so he does, and he says to him, hey, you done so well, you go, you be with your wife. And the only problem is that he doesn't. Uriah doesn't go and stay with his wife that night. And so David's like, alright, I can't do this. Plan 1 didn't work. Plan 2 then is we've got to kill the guy. So he's like, we're going to send him to the front lines, we're effectively just going to get him killed. So that's what he does, and Uriah dies. And then when David receives news of that, he then says to Bathsheba, okay, cool, you come over and you be one of my wives, which she does. And so then David thinks this is all cool, it's all brushed over at this point. Only 2 Samuel 11 verse 27 ends with, but the Lord was displeased with what David had done. And then verse 1 of chapter 12 then picks up with, so the Lord sent Nathan the prophet to tell David this story. There were 2 men in a certain town. One was rich and one was poor. The rich man owned a great many sheep and cattle. The poor man owned nothing but one little lamb he had bought. He raised that little lamb, and it grew up with his children. It ate from the man's own plate and drank from his cup. He cuddled it in his arms like a baby daughter. One day a guest arrived at the home of the rich man, but instead of killing an animal from his own flock or herd, he took the poor man's lamb and killed it and prepared it for his guest. Now Nathan comes with the story, and David then says, David was furious. As surely as the Lord lives, he vowed, any man who would do such a thing deserves to die. He must repay 4 lambs to the poor man for the one he stole and for having no pity. So David thinks, oh, you come to me to tell me this? I will deliver justice. And then Nathan said to David, you are that man. And that's a crushing blow to David at this point. He'd just turned the mirror around and he's like, that's you. And so he says, you are that man. The Lord, the God of Israel, says, I anointed you king of Israel and saved you from the power of Saul. I gave you your master's house and his wives and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And if that had not been enough, I would have given you much, much more. Why then have you despised the word of the Lord and done this horrible deed? For you have murdered Uriah the Hittite with the sword of the Ammonites and stolen his wife. And so Nathan comes to David and he's like, you don't see, you're completely blind to the fact that you're this guy. You think you're delivering justice, you think you're fine, but you're not. And you seem to think you're okay, but the Lord's not pleased. And David, much like us, was concerned with justice, with doing the right thing, but also, like all of us, he was a sinner. And he was so into his sin that he was blind to it. And he then only saw the sin and the justice that he should be delivering to others. And sin's deceptive, and it's going to enslave us to the point of blindness if we let it. We can become so engrossed in our sin and justify it so much that, as 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 19 says, that we can quench the spirit, that when the Lord is convicting us of sin, that we then just say, we try and justify our sin, or we get into sin so much that then the still small voice of the Lord just becomes this background voice that we choose to ignore to instead do whatever we want to do. And we can spend so much time allowing sin in our lives and just wallowing in it, that much like when you spend so much time in the dirt, you kind of just get used to it and it just becomes a part of life. And that's kind of what sin is to us, that it's just that dirt that just dirties our lives, and we just become so used to it that it's not really a bother to us. We don't really notice it as much. Our sin can get so comfortable to us that we're then blind to it. And then we either think that we're fine and, we're fine. Why would the Lord be displeased with me? Or we then only really notice the big sin that we may see that we struggle with, and, it's just, that's our main problem. Like, we're sure we have other problems, but we don't really know about them. And the more acceptable sins in the eyes of the world are then just simply acceptable to us, because we're just so blind to it. Instead, we then turn our focus on sin in others' lives. Matthew 7 verses 4 to 5 says, "How can you think of saying to your friend, 'Let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye,' when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite. First get rid of the log in your own eye, then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye." So, sin blinds us to our own sin, so we aren't really able to effectively help with someone else's struggle in their sin. And we aren't really in much of a position to accurately and effectively help because we're blinded by much really the same sin a lot of the time. Sin causes us to act as those proud hypocrites by acting as a judge to others' sin while we suffer with the same issues. And sometimes we think we see sin in someone else's life that we don't like, when in fact it's just a reflection of our own sin that we don't even recognize in our own lives. Psalm 139 verses 23 to 24 gives us an example of how we should instead be praying. It says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you, and lead me along the path of everlasting life." And there's two parts to that. It's search me and know my heart. That the Lord would point out those things, know my anxious thoughts, point out anything in me that offends you, that the Lord would show those things in our lives. And then there's that second point, that when sin is then revealed, that the Lord would then lead us along the path of everlasting life, that he would lead us in his righteousness, that he would help us to actually sin a lot less than we are right now, that we would actually live a life that is pleasing to the Lord. And as he reveals sin, he doesn't just simply leave us with it, but he's willing to forgive us and to go even further, to make us more like Christ. Day by day, as we continue to submit to him and ask him to change us, to make us more like Christ. So I want to encourage you guys that next time that you see sin in someone else's life, to stop for a minute and search your own heart, as all of us should do, to ask the Lord to reveal sin in our own lives before then asking the Lord if we should speak to that person about their sin. And as we continue to do this, as we practice this, the Lord's going to reveal sin in our lives, and it should then cause us to draw closer to Christ as we realize his mercy and grace, his forgiveness towards us. And then as we see how great a mercy and how great a grace that the Lord has towards us, then that should lead us in having grace and mercy and forgiveness towards others, rather than simply coming out as these judges. But instead we can say, hey, the Lord has forgiven me of so much, I should then do likewise to others as well. So I just wanted to encourage you guys with that tonight. God bless you.